As it turns out, there does have to be a part 2 to America. Where we left off at part 1, the Founding Fathers were in the process of forming a completely new style of government, and in so doing, they created the greatest charter for liberty the world had ever seen. Of course, our first president was General George Washington. April 30th, 1789, he was sworn in, and he realized that everything he did would be a precedent. The first precedence was after his inauguration. He responded with the unscripted text of "So help me God." There's also still the issues going on with Britain in terms of they hadn't left the forts in the Northwest Territory, which we know today as the Ohio River Valley. They continued to sell Indian property, and they were basically in control of the Great Lakes. They banned trade from us with the West Indies. All of the countries or colonies that were under their control, he forced them to embargo America. They were still impressing our soldiers, 9,600 that they absconded with off ships, thinking they were British subjects. Although most of them were American citizens, 1,600 of them were naturally born Americans. And U.S. ships still had to stop in Britain to be inspected, and goods coming to America had to come on British ships. All of this was severely limiting our ability to trade and severely limiting our ability to have any kind of a meaningful income. Washington sent John Jay to Britain to try and work out a new treaty to resolve all these issues. It was called the Jay's Treaty, and it really didn't accomplish resolving any of the issues. All it did, in effect, was create 10 years of peace between us and Great Britain. And at that time, we were able to develop an economy based on agricultural, shipbuilding, and fishing. The cod population along Newfoundland down to Maine was just extraordinary. Shipbuilding, America using oak were the hardest, sturdiest ships built. We could build them for $36 a ton, where Holland or Great Britain charged $55 a ton. So in the 1700s, our 125 shipbuilding yards produced 1,000 ships. The Senate authorized Washington to have a cabinet. So he decided to have a Secretary of Treasury. For that he chose Alexander Hamilton, who supported a national bank and a strong federal government. The Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. He opposed the federal or national bank and was a strong supporter of state sovereignty, state rights under the Constitution. When President Washington refused his third term, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. King George III said that he was the greatest leader in the world because every other leader fought, bribed, stole, cheated, did anything they could to maintain power. The second president was Adams. Unfortunately, he still was unable to resolve the issues with Britain. And in addition to that, now that we didn't have protection from the British Navy, our ships were coming under attack in the Mediterranean Sea by the Barbary pirates. And they were the nations of Tripoli, Algeria, Morocco, and Tanzania. Adams had paid them $80,000 to allow safe passage for our cargo ships, and it wasn't always guaranteed that they would get through. When the ships were absconded by the Barbary pirates, the cargoes were stolen and sold, and the crew was either taken for ransom, and if the countries wouldn't pay the ransom, then they were sold as slaves. The third president was Jefferson, and when he came into office, the Barbary pirates demanded $250,000 lump sum payment up front and $25,000 a year thereafter. That in today's money, that would be like $3.4 million to be paid in tribute. in a country whose national gross product was $10 million. So Jefferson refused, and the Pasha of Tripoli declared war on the United States. So Jefferson told the Congress that he had sent a small fleet to the Mediterranean to try and resolve the issue. Of course, the fleet, 6 ships, was too small. Not much was gained. One of the ships was lost. And the ultimate strategy that did prevail was a retired Army captain, a Marine lieutenant, and 8 Marines recruited a bunch of mercenaries, marched 500 miles across the Sahara Desert, and the U.S. Navy met them at Derna, which was the first city on the way to Tripoli. The warships fired on the city from the water. The Marines and the mercenaries stormed the gates and quickly took over the city and raised the American flag. For the first time, any time, our flag had been raised over a foreign soil. When the Pasha heard of this and knew that they were on their way to Tripoli, he surrendered to President Jefferson and gave up his demands on monetary remuneration, or tribute as they called it at the time. Jefferson also sent Monroe to Paris with an authorization of $10 million to buy Louisiana east to Florida. If he couldn't do that, he was supposed to buy New Orleans. If he couldn't do that, he was supposed to secure shipping rights and trading rights for the city of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. When Monroe got to Paris, it was a completely different offer on the table. Spain had ceded their lands to France, and France's cabinet members for Napoleon told him, "You don't want to fight a war on 2 fronts. I suggest you sell your Spanish gift to the Americans and use that for your war chest." So Monroe made the Louisiana Purchase for $15 million, 828,000 square miles, which eventually became 15 states and part of 2 Canadian provinces. The 4th president, Madison, with all of these issues from Britain still unresolved, read off the list of grievances to Congress and suggested they find a course of action. Now, at this time, Britain had 600 ships. 85 of them were in American waters. They had 250,000 troops that had been battling with Napoleon, and British troops were victorious in their battles against Napoleon. America had 17 ships and 7,000 soldiers. And Congress decided, because of the grievances, they should declare war on Britain. Now, that wasn't totally irrational, because American Congress figured Europe wouldn't have an appetite for a second war as long as they were still at war with Napoleon. Well, Napoleon abdicated and Great Britain declared war on the United States. And they sent troops into Canada. General Provost had 15,000 troops, and he was going to march south along the Mississippi and meet up with Rear Admiral Cochrane after he took New Orleans and came up the Mississippi. So the first thing that set this stage for this war was that Captain Perry defeated the British and took control of Lake Erie, which also gave us control of a portion of the Ohio River Valley. And Lieutenant Thomas McNougat beat the British at Lake Champlain, and that cut off the supply lines to General Provost in his march into invading America. Without resupply from the sea, the ships, he couldn't possibly have his troops supplied by ox carts, so he turned around and went back to Canada, unbeknownst to Rear Admiral Cockburn that he had done that. Rear Admiral Cockburn had been given the orders to take the city of Baltimore. They called it a nest of vipers because that's where most of the privateers were. It was also the home of a lot of the smuggling. Britain had forbid us to trade with the West Indies, and as rum was the primary libation of the colonies, and it would take 106 ounces of molasses and 8 pounds of raw cane sugar to make a gallon of rum. So the smuggling started between us and the Dutch West Indies, and that was part of the reason they wanted to take out Baltimore. The other reason, it was the third largest city, and from there they could launch their own offensive into America. But on the way, they decided to take a detour because they thought it'd be tremendous morale, devastating to America's morale if they'd captured Washington, D.C. So they torched Washington, D.C., burnt all the buildings except the patent office. Then they proceeded to Fort McHenry. They let General Ross with 4,000 troops off on a peninsula to go up and flank the fort once they had rendered it defenseless with the bombardment from the ships in the Gulf. So General Ross encountered the colonists, and he was killed, and his second in command took over, who was fairly inept. They lost 300 men, and he pulled back and waited to see what would happen with the outcome with the ships bombarding Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry, they fired 1,800 cannonballs, rockets, and mortars at the fort to no avail. This is where Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner as he watched all this. So they picked up the soldiers and decided a new venue was in order, and they would go down and take New Orleans and meet General Provost. Because of communication at that time, which was slow, difficult, on foot, on horseback, he had no idea that General Provost had turned around and gone back to Canada. So President Madison sent General Jackson to New Orleans, and when General Jackson got to New Orleans, he saw that the legislates were in session, and they were voting on surrendering the city rather than have it ravaged by war. So he declared martial law and sent them all home. He then gave an impassioned speech to the townspeople to recruit an army, because he only had 700 men. And businessmen joined. It said that 200 free black Haitians joined. Choctaw Indians joined. Creoles joined. So orders were going to have to be given in 5 languages. As soon as Cockburn's path was clear to Andrew Jackson, he occupied a canal that would be in their path on their march to New Orleans. He had previously, when he saw the ships, 60 ships sailed in the Gulf, he sent for his Kentucky and Tennessee marksmen, which were under his purview because he was in charge of Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, that general area. So he took a canal that was going to be in their path, put artillery on each end of the canal, manned it with soldiers with smoothbore muskets and bayonets, because if there was going to be fighting with artillery, it would be hand-to-hand. When his marksmen arrived, and this goes back to during the Revolutionary War, Daniel Morgan had 13 rifle companies of marksmen, and if you were going to be in a marksman with your American rifle, you had to hit a 7-inch target at 200 yards consecutively. So the marksmen lined up in the canal, and General Jackson spaced them 3 feet apart, 4 deep. So the first soldier would fire his round, go to the back, and by the time he was back in the number 1 position, he would be reloaded and ready to fire again. So that would be a hailstone of bullets and projectiles flying at the British in a distance where they were ineffective and using their smoothbores. There wouldn't be anything they could do. So the British decided they would attack the American position in the morning under the cover of the fog. Now, Father de Herbert in New Orleans established a 3-day vigil for prayer for Jackson's soldiers, as well as the nuns of Ursuline nuns set up a 24-day vigil to pray for the protection of Jackson's troops. So in the morning, as the British were advancing on the canal, and it is said by many that were there, and there's many accounts of this, that the fog lifted so fast that they said it was the hand of God. And as soon as the fog listed, the British were within range of the marksmen. So they opened fire, and 25 minutes later, the battle was over. 868 British lay dead on the battlefield. 2,648 lay wounded. Jackson had lost 8 dead and 14 wounded. As soon as he saw that the British were sincere in their efforts to call off the war, it was a true surrender, he sent his men out to help with the wounded and help bury the dead. This was the Second War of Independence for America, and it kind of set the stage worldwide. And Britain even acknowledged that America was a sovereign, independent nation and had the rights to govern its own people and its own government and business. They also established, President Monroe established the Monroe Doctrine, which meant that other countries were to stay out of the Northern Hemisphere, Americans' business, and we would stay out of other people's business. When General Washington left in his final farewell speech, he said, don't become a debtor nation. Don't be obligated to anybody else. You don't have a big enough army or navy to be a factor in world forces, so you should remain independent and don't form any allies, because then you'll be forced to take part in concerns that don't have a factor in America's future or its longevity. So that's the end of part 2. America, what the hell went wrong? Remember, you can get all my books on Amazon. Just War, A Soldier's Revelation, Things to Come, A Brief History of the Bible, and America, What the Hell Went Wrong. Thanks for listening, and please leave comments. Thank you.